In this part of the series, we'll show how we can highlight friends and enemies using different colors, turn them on, turn them off, and how we can change the scan distance at which they appear. And we'll also get rid of any sort of blurring effects that were present before, so that the outlines are nice and clear to be seen. We can clear them and we can remove our effect. So in our previous video we created this highlight effect that you could turn on and off, and we applied it to the camera post-process settings. The material that we used was this highlight material, and we took advantage of the render in custom depth, and we compared the pixel's custom depth to its scene depth in order to determine whether we showed a highlight color or the original color. However, there is no more information available in this custom depth, so we don't know whether, for instance, whether the custom depth of this character is a friendly character or an enemy character. And if we wanted to apply different colors to our characters or to our objects, whether they were friendly or they were enemies or any other categorization, we can't really do that using the custom depth. However, when we look at the custom depth, if we click on our character, filter for custom, and on the mesh, if we look at the render custom depth, there is this custom depth stencil value available. And this stencil value refers to the stencil buffer. So if we first of all we go to the buffer visualization, see we have the custom depth buffer available, and if I go down, we can see that these two characters are rendered on the custom depth. There is also a visualization for the stencils, for a custom stencil, but when I click that, nothing is being rendered on the custom stencil. So how do we access the information available on the stencil buffer or this custom stencil? So in order to use the custom stencil, first of all you need to go to your project settings, and if you type in stencil under engine rendering post-processing, you have this custom depth stencil pass. By default it says enabled, so it says the depth buffer is created but the stencil is disabled. We want to enable with stencil, so we enable it there. Now if we go to one of our characters and we go to the custom depth, if we change its custom depth stencil value to 1, now you see that it's being rendered with a custom stencil value of 1. If we were to take this other character here and give it a custom stencil value of 2, you now see that there is the 2 showing up on the stencil buffer. And these values can go all the way up to 255. So you could have 255 different objects being rendered with a different stencil value. And using this value, we can then decide what color each one of these should be highlighted with. So I put these back down to 0 first of all. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to create a stencil post-processing material. So if I go here and I go for material, I call this post-process material stencil, because we're using the stencil buffer. And if I open that, so I'll first of all we'll set this as being post-process. So now it's post-process and we have an emissive color. And the way that we're going to try and do this is that when we activate the effect, we'll maybe desaturate the screen so it goes black and white, and then each of these enemies and friends will be highlighted in their respective colors, red or green. So if we go back here and let's just do some initial setup. So again, we need a scene texture node. Now from the scene texture, when you're using stencils, you do have a stencil, custom stencil. You can sort of component mask that, and it would give you the value of the stencil that you're setting here. But there is a better way of doing this, so we'll get to that in a second. So first of all, we'll get the original color so we can desaturate it. So that's post-process input 0. We'll component mask that to get the RGB. We want the default effect to be black and white, so we'll desaturate it. That will make it black and white, and then we will just store a named reroute. That will be our original color. We'll also set some, so we'll set the enemy color to be red, and we'll name reroute that to say enemy color, and we'll set the friendly to be green, so RGB G will be 1, and we'll name reroute that and call that the friend color. So that gives us these three. Now what we need to do is, on the stencil buffer, we will get the stencil value of the pixel. So we need to compare that value to the respective value for a friend or an enemy. And what we'll do is if we click on the little guy here, we'll say that our friends will have a stencil value, or our enemies, well, let's do the enemy first. So the enemy will have a stencil value of 1, and say our friend will have a stencil value of 2. So we set the stencil values here. Save that, and we go back to our material. Now instead of using the stencil from here, which I showed you, just to go down to stencil, custom stencil, there is a built-in node called stencil mask compare. You give it the stencil value you want to compare to, and if it matches, you'll get 1. If it doesn't match, you will get 0. So with a 0 and 1, that makes it easy for us to do a lerp. So we'll first lerp check to see if it's an enemy. So let's just create a parameter here, scalar parameter. This is our enemy stencil value, and we set that to be 1. So we can put this into a lerp 0 to 1. If it is 1, we want to show the enemy color. So if it matches, draw that pixel in red. If it doesn't, we'll tell it to show the original color. So that will be basically the first filter or first pass. We can then give this a name. This is the, let's call that a named reroute. Say this is the enemy stencil result. Now we can run another pass on this result that comes through using a friendly stencil value. So we get the stencil mask compare. We can get another scalar parameter and call this the friend stencil value, and we gave that a value of 2. Then we can lerp here again. This will be a 0 to 1. If it is 1, we want to show the friend color. So this pixel belongs to a friend stencil. And if it doesn't, well, we'll show what the first pass result was. So we'll say enemy stencil result. And if we then just plug this into here, apply and save that, in our character that we're using, which is the same character as before, if you go to the first person and in its post-process materials, just search for material, we'll change that to our ppm stencil that we're just creating. And if we now play and press 1, we now get our friend in green and our enemy in red. Of course, if I turn it on, they will turn red and green, even if there is nothing blocking our view like a wall. So if we want that to only show behind walls, we do what we did previously in our other materials. So we go here and we get another scene texture. So we compare the custom depth and the scene depth together to see which one is further. To check if this custom depth is behind the scene depth, then we show it. So this will be the custom depth. Get another scene texture. This will be our scene depth. Component mask. So these will just be float values. And then we can do an if statement. And we compare the custom depth value to the scene depth value. If the custom depth is greater than scene depth, so it's behind something, we want to show the friendly result. So that's the second pass result, isn't it? Friend. Maybe we should put this as a named reroute as well. So this is the friendly stencil result. And if it isn't, we just show the original color. And this will be our, just call that the end result. And then we can put the end result into here. So if we play again, press 1, it doesn't show, but when he's behind something, it will show. So the highlight would only happen if there's something blocking the character. So this works. However, it shows regardless of how far we are away from the characters, and perhaps we only want it to show when we reach a certain threshold. So how do we set that as a variable that we can control? So if we go back to our highlight material, or not highlight, I mean our stencil material, what we can do is we can test to see how far what the custom depth is of that pixel, and then decide whether to show the highlight color or not. So we get another scene texture. We'll get the custom depth for this. We component mask it because the result is on the red channel. And say we want it to show when we are within 1,000 Unreal units of the character or of that pixel with this stencil value. So we can divide that. We could put that as 1,000 to begin with. What we know is that if we are less than 1000, then this value will be less than 1. In which case, if we floor it, anything between 0 and 0.99 will become 0. Anything above will be above 1. So we floor this. That will come to 0 if we're within the threshold. We can saturate it, which then means it's clamped between 0 and 1. And then we can lerp here. Use this, which will be a 0 to 1 value. If it is 0, we want to show the end result that we created up here. This end result reroute. So we can put the end result in there, and if it is above the threshold, so the value will be 1, we show the original color. And then we can connect this, bring this down, connect this to the emissive. So apply that, save it, and if we play, so to begin with, so it's only when we get close that it will show, even if the effect is on or off. So 1 will show and then it will not. Of course, we might want to make that to be a variable that we can control, and the best way of doing that would be by using a material parameter collection. And I've done videos on how you can set material parameters previously, and a material parameter collection would be the best thing to use here. So if we go to material, create a material parameter collection, we can just call this MPC stencil. We'll put this as a scalar parameter, so we can call this maybe the scan distance, so the distance that it scans to show highlighted characters. Maybe just set that at 1000 again. Save it, go to our material, look for collection parameter. It finds our MPC stencil we created. We can get our scan distance and we can put that in there. And it should work exactly the same. So not showing, we come closer, it shows beyond 1000 units. It's not showing. Now when we look at these outlines, you can see that they're slightly jittering, which is not ideal. So how do we deal with some of these issues? So that jitter there. Let's go back to our material. Now that comes down to how things are being blended. So if you click on the stencil material and if you search for blend, you'll get the post-process material blendable location. Here it blends after tone mapping has been done. So you can experiment with each one of these to see which gives you the best outcome. Often seeing color before DOF can be useful. And now if we go back, we play, we come close, you see that there's no jitter. However, we get this issue now, where it's blurred when we start to move really fast. So what's the cause of that? Well, basically this is motion blur. And to show how you can sort of change that in a project level, if you search for motion, go to your project settings, search for motion blur. We just turn that off straight off here, and now we play, we come, we don't get that motion blur anymore. However, you might not want to turn it off in your whole project. So how can we sort of customize when it is on or off? Let's just go back and turn it back on. So we'll turn it back on, which is how it is by default. And if we go back to our character, we go to our first person. In the post process, if you go down, you should know you can search actually for blur, I think it's called motion blur. Under rendering there is a motion blur, and you can set the amount of blur. So by default it is 0.5. If we set that to 0, and we play again, turn on the effect, go close. So again, there is no motion blur. But we might not, again, if we set that by default, then there will be no motion blur when we're using this camera and the material that we've added. So how do we, so I put that back to 0.5. I turn that off. How do we turn this on and off based on turning the camera effect on and off? So the way we do that is we get the first person camera, we can get the post-process settings, from that we can break this, so it's a struct, and we can look then for, so on the broken one we can look for the motion, and we want to set the amount, and this we can say set by reference, because we only want to set this one value. So when we turn on the effect we want it to be 0, and when we turn off the effect we want to set it back to 0.5, so that it doesn't interfere with other effects which are taking place. Now in order for this to actually work, you do have to, in the actual first person camera, on its post-process rendering, you do have to tick this on so that it is activated and these values will change. So if all that works, everything should be exactly the same again. Play, turn it on, come close, and there is no motion blur. So that takes care of that issue. So there is another issue to look out for if you're using a third person character, for instance. So we've got this on a third person character, and the problem here is that it's obviously coming through the character itself or showing on the character's material. So how do we deal with this issue? The easiest way there is if you go to that character, and on its mesh just check for look for custom depth, rendering custom depth, turn on the rendering custom depth and give it its own stencil value, so give it 3 for instance. Now if we go back and we play, it doesn't show through the camera, so it doesn't appear between the camera and the character. So that takes care of that. If you're getting this issue here when we play and we sort of go in, and on the ground the highlight is showing, or when it's against a surface it's also showing, and the reason for that is because there is perhaps a bit of intersection between the custom depth and the object below. So the way that we could solve that is if we go back to our material, and probably at the end here, if we do a check between the custom depth and the scene depth. So here we'll get the custom depth. We'll get another scene texture node, This one will be the scene depth. We'll component mask that, red channel, component mask, red channel. And what we can do is we can test for the distance between the pixel with custom depth that is showing the highlight and the scene depth pixels, which should not be showing the highlight. So there's a simple distance node somewhere, distance, and then we can use sort of similar logic that we used before. So we get the distance, we can divide it by a threshold, so let's just say maybe 15 units or 15 pixels. Then we can floor it like we've done before to get a 0 to 1, saturate it, and then we can do another lerp using this as the alpha. And essentially if it's if it's 0, as in the pixels, this custom depth and scene depth are very close, we'll just show the original color, so we'll remove any highlight. And if it isn't, well, this one that we're putting in we can just put in here instead, and then we can put that into the emissive. So apply, save, and if we just play, we turn on our effect, so it's shown normally outside, and when we come in we don't get that highlight showing against the wall or on the floor either, like we were previously. So that should solve that particular issue. So basically using this post-process material and using the stencil buffer and the stencil values and just chaining checks across the pixels that are coming through, you can have up to 255 different colors. Because if you wanted to then check for that's an enemy, that's a friend, and some fool or idiot, you would just then do exactly the same again, give that character a different stencil value, and use this result in your lerp, and then you'd be able to have a third color on there, or a fourth color, or a fifth, and so on. And if you use the material parameter collections, you can then change the distance at which the effect of the highlight turns on or off. You could also set these as material parameter collection values, and you could change the stencil values themselves. So that essentially creates our effect, where we can turn it on, we can turn it off, we can turn it back on again, and based on the distance it will show or not show. And we shouldn't get any, it should be quite sharp lines on the stencils and no motion blurring as well. So putting it all together, we can try it out on a scene. So this has just been downloaded from the marketplace, and if I play, I turn on our effect, I can then pick our friendlies, so I'll show up friendlies, click to show up enemies, I can turn off the enemies, or I can turn off the friendlies, turn them back on again. I can change the scan distance shown here, and as I do that some of these enemies will disappear or start showing back up again, and I can remove the effect and go back to the normal color, turn it back on again. So the way this is done, essentially I've got each of our characters, I've given them a gameplay tag, and I've shown in other videos how you can use gameplay tags and set them up. They can either be a friend or an enemy, and then there is a widget which I've created, and some of these are just material effects. And essentially in the widget, when you click the button, it sets the stencil value based on whether it's a friend or an enemy. So it will search for all the actors, it will check to see that their gameplay tag is valid. If it is, it will check the gameplay tag, and then it will essentially turn on the render custom depth and set a stencil value for that particular character. And that's how it will show and unshow. So all of this is based on what we already looked at. So with everything that I've shown you so far, you should be able to create an effect like this. There's nothing too complicated in it otherwise. So just a widget, some text blocks, some animations, and the key is in here that I'm setting the render custom depth on the actor's mesh on or off, and I'm giving it a value. And basically when the stencil value is 0, no effect shows. So I hope that shows you how you can use the stencil buffer to create slightly more complex and useful effects.